The fog clung to the pines like a shroud, muffling the world in a grey hush that made every snapped twig echo like a gunshot. It was the autumn of 1982, in the forgotten stretches of the Pacific Northwest, where the woods swallowed secrets whole and spat out only bones. Sheriff Harlan Reed had driven these winding roads 1,000 times, but tonight the beams of his patrol car sliced through the mist like knives through flesh, revealing nothing but endless ranks of trees standing sentinel. The call had come in late, hikers babbling about lights in the sky, voices murmuring from the underbrush, and figures that didn't move quite right. Harlan dismissed it as another mushroom-fueled tall tale, but something in their wide-eyed panic gnawed at him, a prickling at the base of his skull that wouldn't let go. He pulled off the gravel path onto a barely there trail, the engine rumbling to a stop as the forest closed in. Flashlight in hand, he trudged forward, boots sinking into the damp earth that smelled of rot and rain. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if the trees themselves were breathing. Then he heard it, a low hum, not quite a whisper, threading through the branches like wind through cracks in an old house. "Hello," he called, his voice swallowed by the dark. No answer, but the hum grew, resolving into fragments, words. No, something older, alien, curling around his mind like smoke. Deeper in, the beam caught on a clearing, unnatural in its perfection, ringed by stones etched with symbols that twisted the eye. Huts huddled there, woven from branches and hides, and in the center, a fire flickered weakly, casting long shadows. Figures emerged from the gloom, men and women in ragged clothes, their faces gaunt and watchful. But it was the boys who stopped Harlan cold. 5 of them, no older than 12, huddled together, their skin pale as moonlight, eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that wasn't right, like polished glass. They didn't blink. Didn't speak. Just stared, and in that stare, Harlan felt a chill that went bone deep, as if they were seeing through him to something vast and empty beyond. One of the elders stepped forward, his voice a rasp like dry leaves. "You've found the Arokat Clan, stranger. But some things found are better left lost." Harlan's hand hovered near his holster, the weight of the unknown pressing down. He didn't know it yet, but this was the unraveling, the moment when the ordinary world cracked open, spilling out horrors that science couldn't name and faith couldn't face. As the boys began to murmur in unison, their voices syncing with the hum in the trees, Harlan realized the dark wasn't empty. It was listening. Waiting to end the fall of 1982, the Pacific Northwest had been soaked by weeks of relentless rain, turning the backcountry trails into slick ribbons of mud that sucked at boots and tires alike. A group of 4 experienced hikers, 3 college friends from Seattle and a local guide who knew the Cascades like his own veins, set out for a long weekend in an area rarely visited, far beyond the marked paths of the national forest. They were chasing solitude, the kind that erases the noise of the city and leaves only the sound of wind through ancient firs. By late afternoon on their second day, the light was already thinning, bleeding into the heavy canopy overhead. They had veered off their planned route, drawn by an old, overgrown logging road that promised a shortcut to a high ridge with rumored views. Instead, the trail narrowed, choked by Salal and Devil's Club, until it vanished entirely. The forest grew unnaturally quiet, no birds, no rustle of small animals, just the soft drip of water from needles and their own breathing. One of the hikers, a biology major named Claire, noticed it first, a faint, rhythmic glow pulsing between the trunks ahead, too steady for fireflies, too low for aircraft. The group hesitated, but curiosity pulled them forward. They pushed through a wall of cedar branches and stepped into a small, hidden hollow they later swore wasn't on any map. There, half concealed by moss and shadow, stood a cluster of crude shelters built from woven branches and animal hides. Smoke rose thinly from a central fire pit, carrying a strange, metallic scent that clung to the back of the throat. Figures moved at the edges of the clearing, adults in rough, handmade clothing, their movements slow and deliberate. But what froze the hikers in place were the children. 5 boys, none appearing older than 12, stood in a loose semicircle near the fire. Their skin was strikingly pale, almost translucent in the dim light, as if they had never seen full sun. Their hair was uniformly dark and straight, falling over eyes that caught the faint glow and reflected it back unnaturally, like a cat's in headlights. They wore simple tunics stitched from hides, barefoot despite the cold mud. When the hikers emerged, The boys did not startle or cry out. They simply turned their heads in perfect unison and stared. Then came the sound, a low, murmuring chant rising from the boys in a language none of the hikers recognized. It wasn't singing, wasn't speaking exactly, but something in between, syllables sliding together like water over stones. The adults in the camp paused their tasks and watched silently, making no move to intervene. The guide, a man who had spent decades in these woods, felt the hair rise on his arms. He whispered to the others that they should back away slowly, but Claire was already stepping closer, her scientific mind overriding fear. The boys' eyes never blinked. Their chant grew slightly louder, weaving through the trees, and for a moment the hikers felt it inside their skulls, a pressure like the onset of a migraine. The forest seemed to lean in, branches creaking though there was no wind. In that hollow, time felt suspended, as if the clearing existed slightly apart from the world they knew. The hikers would later argue about how long they stood there, minutes, or far longer. What they agreed on was the overwhelming sense of being watched by something ancient and patient. When they finally retreated, stumbling backward through the brush, the chant followed them for 100 yards before fading into the damp silence. They did not camp that night. They hiked out in the dark, flashlights shaking in their hands, and by morning they were at the ranger station, breathless and pale, trying to explain what they had found deep in the woods, a hidden clan, and boys who did not seem entirely human. By the time the hikers' report reached Sheriff Harlan Reed's desk, 3 days had passed, and the story had already mutated through layers of skepticism and second-hand exaggeration. It was early November 1982, and the small county sheriff's office in the shadow of the Cascades smelled of wet wool, burnt coffee, and the faint mildew that never quite left the walls this time of year. Harlan, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with a mustache gone grey at the edges, had heard every kind of backwoods tale in his 20 years on the job: Bigfoot tracks, UFO landings, runaway cults, but something about the hikers' shaken demeanor stuck with him. They weren't laughing it off. They weren't asking for attention. They just wanted someone official to go look. The call about strange lights came in again that same week, this time from a logger working a clear-cut 5 miles west of the hikers' coordinates. He described a steady blue-white glow hovering low over the treetops just after dusk, silent, no engine noise, gone by the time he grabbed his radio. Harlan logged it, grumbled about kids with flares, but the two reports overlapped too neatly to ignore. He decided to drive out himself. Dusk was bleeding into full night when he nosed his Ford Bronco down the rutted logging spur, headlights carving tunnels through the dripping firs. Rain pattered on the roof like impatient fingers. He killed the engine a quarter-mile from the reported location and walked the rest, boots squelching, maglite beam sweeping the understory. The forest was loud with water but otherwise empty, no owls, no coyotes, just the steady drip and his own breathing. Then the lights appeared. They flickered once between the trunks ahead, pale and cold, not the warm orange of a campfire. Harlan froze, hand instinctively dropping to the grip of his service revolver. The glow pulsed again, steadying into a soft, rhythmic shimmer that seemed to come from ground level. He moved forward, slow, placing each foot with care to avoid snapping branches. The air grew heavier, charged, like the moment before lightning. He broke into the hidden hollow and stopped short. The clearing was just as the hikers described, crude shelters ringed by mossy stones, a low fire smoldering in the center. Adults stood motionless at the edges, faces half-lit, watching him with the wary stillness of deer. But the boys commanded every ounce of his attention. 5 of them, arranged in a loose arc, barefoot in the mud, skin luminous in the firelight. Their eyes caught the glow and threw it back, unblinking, fixed on him with an intensity that felt almost physical, like a pressure against his chest. Harlan's mouth went dry. He raised the flashlight, beam trembling slightly as it crossed their faces. They did not flinch. Did not shield their eyes. One tilted his head, slow, deliberate, and the others mirrored the motion a heartbeat later. A low sound rose from them, soft, layered, not quite voices but something that vibrated behind his eyes and made the fillings in his teeth ache. He took one involuntary step back, boot heel sinking into mud. The adults remained silent, neither advancing nor retreating, as if this confrontation had been expected. Harlan's radio crackled faintly on his belt, but when he keyed it, only static answered. The boy's stare never wavered, and in that endless moment, pinned beneath their glass-like gaze, he felt something ancient measuring him, weighing whether he belonged to the world of light and law or to the deeper dark that waited patiently between the trees. Sheriff Harlan Reed didn't sleep much in the days after his night in the hollow. The boy's unblinking stares followed him into the station, into his truck, into the quiet of his trailer where the rain drummed on the tin roof like accusing fingers. By the end of the week, he had rounded up 2 deputies and a child services caseworker from County Social Services, armed with a vague warrant for welfare check and possible endangerment. They returned at dawn, 4 vehicles strong, headlights cutting through low fog that still refused to lift. The Arokat Clan did not resist. The adults stood aside as the boys were coaxed or gently led into the waiting vans. No one cried. No one ran. The children moved with the same deliberate calm Harlan remembered, their bare feet leaving faint prints in the mud that seemed too light for their size. One of the deputies muttered that it felt like loading ghosts. They drove the boys straight to St. Mary's Regional Hospital, a low brick complex 40 miles down the valley that served logging towns and remote homesteads alike. The emergency room director, Dr. Evelyn Carver, met them in the ambulance bay, coffee in hand, eyebrows raised at the unusual convoy. Harlan gave her the short version: isolated group, possible neglect, unknown medical history. She nodded, used to mountain oddities, and cleared a secure wing on the 2nd floor. Routine intake began immediately. Nurses drew blood, checked height and weight, shone lights into eyes and ears. The boys sat quietly on the exam tables, legs dangling, allowing every procedure without protest or curiosity. Their temperatures registered slightly low, pulses steady but slow, lungs clear. Skin was cool to the touch, almost waxy. When a nurse pressed a stethoscope to one boy's chest, she frowned and adjusted the diaphragm, listening again. The heartbeat was there, but faint, as if muffled by distance. Blood work went to the lab first. Within hours, the on-duty technician called Dr. Carver to the microscope, voice tight. Red cells looked normal enough under low power, but something about the staining felt off. White cell counts were unusually low, almost absent in places. Platelets clumped strangely. She ordered repeats, then sent samples to the larger reference lab in Seattle with a rush flag. Preliminary serology came back blank: no antibodies for measles, mumps, rubella, polio, nothing. No reaction to standard blood typing reagents. The samples neither agglutinated nor settled the way A, B, or O should. The tech ran controls twice, thinking contamination, but the boys' tubes behaved identically each time. Dr. Carver stood over the reports late into the evening, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the corridor outside unnaturally quiet. By midnight, the Seattle lab phoned. Their hematologist sounded rattled. Chromosomal spreads prepared from the samples showed 46 structures, but the banding patterns didn't match any human reference. Certain regions glowed strangely under specific dyes, sequences repeating in ways no known genome did. The voice on the line hesitated, then said the phrase that would echo through every subsequent briefing: "These aren't mapping to anything in our database. Not Homo sapiens. Not any primate." Dr. Carver hung up and stared at the 5 small figures visible through the observation window, sitting in a neat row on their cots, eyes open, reflecting the hallway light like polished obsidian. For the first time since medical school, she felt the floor tilt beneath her certainties, the sterile order of diagnoses and treatments giving way to a colder, wider unknown that waited just beyond the fluorescent glow. The samples from the 5 boys sat in a locked refrigerator in the basement of the University of Washington's genetics lab, labeled only with alphanumeric codes and the urgent red sticker that meant "do not discard." It was mid-November 1982, and Dr. Martin Hale, a soft-spoken cytogeneticist with a reputation for meticulous work, had pulled 2 all-nighters in a row after the Seattle reference lab escalated the case directly to him. The initial karyotypes had already unsettled the referring hematologist. Hale's task was to sequence deeper and map whatever anomalies refused to fit standard human profiles. He worked alone in the dim glow of the lab's hood lights, the hum of the sequencer a constant companion. Peripheral blood lymphocytes were cultured, harvested, and dropped onto slides. Under the microscope, The chromosomes spread in familiar pairs, 46 in total, but the G-banding revealed patterns that made Hale's stomach tighten. Certain arms were elongated in ways no human polymorphism accounted for. Repetitive satellite regions glowed too brightly under quinacrine staining, as if overloaded with heterochromatin no primate genome carried in such density. He moved to restriction fragment analysis, cutting the DNA with multiple enzymes and running the fragments on agarose gels. The banding ladders that emerged refused to match any control lanes, neither human, nor chimpanzee, nor the archived samples of Neanderthal reconstructions making headlines that year. Some fragments migrated to positions that suggested insertions of sequences thousands of base pairs long, sequences that repeated in perfect, unnerving symmetry. By the end of the week, Hale had isolated and cloned several of these anomalous regions. Early Sanger sequencing, painstaking, manual, radioactive, began to yield readable ladders on the autoradiographs. He taped the films to the lightbox in sequence, tracing the bases with a grease pencil. The strings that emerged contained long stretches of non-coding repeats unlike any in GenBank's nascent collection. More disturbing were the coding segments, open reading frames that aligned poorly with known proteins, producing hypothetical amino acid chains that folded, in preliminary models, into structures no terrestrial enzyme recognized. Hale called in a colleague from molecular anthropology, then another from comparative genomics. They stood together in silence, staring at the films. One whispered that the sequences resembled nothing so much as synthetic constructs, too clean, too optimized. Another pointed out codon usage bias that favored rare tRNAs, as if the genome had been shaped by an entirely different translational machinery. Late one night, alone again, Hale ran a crude blast-like comparison against everything available in the lab's primitive database. No significant hits. He then aligned the boys' consensus against the human reference he had helped build the year prior. The mismatch was staggering. Core housekeeping genes diverged by margins that should have been lethal, yet the boys lived, breathed, sat quietly upstairs under guard. Introns carried motifs that echoed viral integration sites, but no known virus left such pristine scars. He sat back, the dark lab pressing in, the faint clicks of the cooling sequencer the only sound. The data stared back at him, immutable on the films and gels. Whatever these children carried in their cells, it was not a mutation, not a contamination, not an artifact of preparation. It was a genome that branched away from the human line so profoundly that no shared ancestor within millions of years could explain the overlap that remained. The implications settled over him like cold water. The boys were human enough to walk and breathe among us, but something fundamental in their blueprint originated elsewhere, encoded in spirals that no earthbound evolution had authored. Word of the anomalous DNA results traveled upward fast, bypassing normal channels. By early December 1982, a black government sedan with Washington plates appeared unannounced in the hospital parking lot, followed hours later by two more. Men in plain dark suits stepped out, credentials folded neatly in wallets that flashed gold emblems too quickly to read. They met first with the hospital administrator, then with Dr. Carver and Sheriff Reed in a locked conference room where the blinds were drawn tight against the gray afternoon. The lead agent introduced himself only as Mr. Vaughn, voice flat, eyes scanning the room as if memorizing exits. He laid out the new reality with quiet efficiency. The boys and all related materials were now under federal jurisdiction, classified under national security protocols. Local law enforcement cooperation was appreciated but no longer required. Any discussion of the case outside this room would be considered a breach. That same evening, military transport arrived, olive-drab buses with blackout curtains and escorted by unmarked Suburbans. Armed personnel in unmarked fatigues established a perimeter around the pediatric wing. Nurses were reassigned, phones in the corridor were disconnected. The boys were moved one by one on gurneys, still silent, still unresisting, down a service elevator to waiting vehicles. Dr. Carver watched from an upper window as they were loaded, small forms disappearing into the dark interiors like shadows folding into deeper shadow. Back in the hidden hollow, a larger operation unfolded under floodlights powered by humming generators. Teams in hazmat suits combed the clearing, cataloging every hut, every etched stone, every scrap of hide clothing. Samples of soil, water, plant matter were sealed in numbered vials. The adult clan members were separated, questioned in portable trailers, then relocated to an undisclosed facility. The site itself was cordoned with chain link and razor wire by dawn, signs posted warning of environmental contamination. At the university lab, Dr. Hale received a polite but firm visit. All slides, gels, autoradiographs, and sequencing films were confiscated, boxed, and loaded into a van under guard. His notebooks were photocopied on the spot, originals taken. He was read a non-disclosure agreement thick with subsections and penalties, then escorted from his own building until the transfer was complete. Media inquiries began trickling in. A local reporter had caught wind of missing children and federal activity in the county, but stories died quickly. Wire service interest evaporated after single phone calls. The county sheriff's office released a brief statement about a resolved welfare case involving a reclusive family now in protective custody. No further details available. By mid-December, the hospital wing stood empty, scrubbed to sterility, records sealed. The forest clearing was bulldozed flat, the ground seeded with fast-growing rye to erase the outlines of what had stood there. Satellite imagery would later show only uniform green where the hollow had been. Official channels recorded nothing unusual, just another quiet intervention in a remote community, paperwork routed through agencies that didn't appear in public directories. Yet in the classified briefings that followed, the designations stuck: potential extraterrestrial biological entities, hybrid phenotype, origin unknown. The boys, now designated subjects A1 through A5, vanished into a succession of secure facilities, their files stamped with codes that climbed higher in clearance with each transfer. The machinery of containment ground forward, efficient and absolute, swallowing every trace of the discovery into vaults where daylight and questions were equally unwelcome. Deep in a windowless facility somewhere east of the Cascades, the adult members of the Arokat clan were separated into individual rooms, each furnished with a metal table, 2 chairs, and a one-way mirror that reflected only their own exhausted faces. The interrogations began politely, coffee offered, questions about living conditions, health, family history, but the elders gave little. They spoke in measured, heavily accented English, calling themselves keepers of an old line, descendants of those who had welcomed the travelers from the high dark. The lead interviewer, a grey-haired linguist brought in for his expertise with indigenous oral traditions, pressed harder after days of circular answers. He laid photographs on the table, aerial shots of the cleared hollow, close-ups of the etched stones, drawings the boys had made under observation, spirals within spirals, figures with elongated skulls standing beneath grids of stars. At the sight of the stones, the eldest woman, called only Mother Sarah, leaned forward for the first time. Her eyes, the same reflective sheen as the boys, fixed on the images. She began to speak without prompting, voice low and steady, as if reciting something memorized across lifetimes. Long ago, she said, when the great fires still walked the sky, visitors came down in vessels of silent light. They did not conquer. They asked. Certain bloodlines, those who lived apart, who kept the old ways, were chosen. Unions were made, not taken. Children were born who carried marks of both worlds, the endurance of Earth and the sight of the stars. These children were protected, hidden, taught to listen for the next coming. The linguist recorded every word, heart pounding beneath his professional calm. Sarah described rituals held on nights when certain constellations aligned, circles of stones, chants in a tongue that predated any known language family, offerings of blood willingly given to renew the bond. The boys, she said, were the purest yet born, their veins carrying more of the traveler's gift than any before. They heard the voices clearly, saw paths through the dark that ordinary eyes could not. Other elders, questioned separately, told versions that matched in precise detail, dates of visitations stretching back centuries, descriptions of tall figures with skin like polished obsidian, eyes that held entire galaxies. They spoke of promises, an eventual return, a lifting of veils, a merging that would save both kinds when the earth grew too heavy with its own weight. The clan's isolation was not fear, they insisted, but duty. To keep the line clean. To wait. Transcripts piled up, cross-referenced, analyzed for inconsistency. None appeared. Polygraphs, administered despite protests, showed no deception spikes. Blood drawn from the adults revealed subtle but undeniable deviations, similar repetitive sequences to the boys, though diluted, as if generations of blending had softened the original imprint. The interviewers began to feel the weight of centuries in the room, stories too coherent to be delusion, too precise to be invention. In the margins of one report, an analyst scribbled a single line: "If this tradition is fabricated, it is the most elaborate and consistent hoax in recorded history." No one underlined it, but everyone read it. The elders sat back after their telling, calm again, as if unburdened. They had shared what was permitted. The rest, they said, belonged to the boys and to the dark that still listened beyond the walls. As winter tightened its grip in late December 1982, the secure facility holding the boys and their elders began to register disturbances that no protocol could classify. It started subtly. Security cameras in the corridors flickered with brief bursts of static, always at 2:17 a.m., always on the same 3 monitors facing the boys' isolation wing. Technicians replaced cables, checked power supplies, ran diagnostics. The glitches persisted, patterns emerging in the snow, faint silhouettes of tall, elongated figures that vanished when the tape was rewound. Guards on night shift reported hearing voices through the vents, soft and layered, speaking in the same sliding syllables the boys had murmured in the forest. The words were never captured on the directional microphones installed after the move, yet multiple personnel logged the same phrases independently, transcribing phonetic strings that linguists later matched to the elders' ritual chants. One sergeant swore the voices addressed him by a childhood nickname no file contained. Scientific instruments misbehaved next. EEG machines hooked to the boys during sleep studies produced flatlines interrupted by sudden, synchronized spikes across all 5 subjects, even when separated by floors and shielded rooms. The spikes aligned with geomagnetic readings that dipped unnaturally low, as if something nearby were drawing current from the Earth itself. Mass spectrometers analyzing air samples from their cells flagged trace elements iridium, europium in concentrations far above background, ratios matching certain meteorite classes but appearing and vanishing within hours. Dr. Hale, granted limited access under heavy escort, returned to observe and found his Geiger counter ticking erratically near the observation glass. The boys sat cross-legged on their cots, eyes closed, palms upturned. When he approached, the counter fell silent. When he stepped back, it resumed. He noticed frost blooming in delicate fractals across the inside of the glass, though the room temperature held steady at 70 degrees. The patterns resembled the spirals etched on the clan's stones. In the adult detention wing, Mother Sarah began humming during interviews, a low thrumming note that vibrated in observers' chests. Lights dimmed in rhythm. One interviewer's cassette recorder captured only silence where Dr. Elias Whitcomb had always prided himself on empirical distance, a shield forged in years of grants, peer reviews, and the cold comfort of data. Yet something about the boys pulled at him in ways no protocol could justify. Assigned to the observation team in January 1983, he spent hours behind the one-way glass, logging their stillness, their synchronized breathing, the way their eyes tracked movements they shouldn't have been able to see. The others kept professional boundaries. Whitcomb began staying late, long after shifts ended and corridors emptied. It started with small violations, leaving a notebook open on the ledge, sketching spirals he'd seen in their drawings, hoping for a reaction. One night, alone under the low red safety lights, he placed his palm flat against the glass separating him from the nearest boy, subject A3. The child rose without sound and mirrored the gesture, forehead almost touching the barrier. Whitcomb felt a warmth spread through his hand, then a pressure behind his eyes, gentle but insistent, like fingers turning pages in his mind. Images came unbidden. Starfields wheeling overhead, tall silhouettes ringed by cold light, a sense of waiting that stretched across centuries. Beneath it, a quieter thread, curiosity, almost loneliness, and a question shaped without words. Do you understand yet? Whitcomb pulled away gasping, heart racing, the room suddenly too small. The boy resumed his seat as if nothing had passed between them. The contact grew nightly. Whitcomb learned to quiet his thoughts, to let the impressions flow. He saw glimpses of the clan's hidden life, rituals under moonless skies, elders passing stories like fragile flames, the boys learning to dampen their shine so the outer world wouldn't notice. Deeper still, he sensed purpose. The children weren't accidents or abductions. They were bridges, cultivated over generations, meant to carry something back when the time came. Not invasion in the crude sense, but exchange, knowledge, adaptation, perhaps salvation for a lineage that had grown too fragile in its isolation. He began leaving written questions, slipped beneath the door slot during guard changes. Who are you waiting for? What do you need from us? Answers arrived not on paper but in dreams that felt borrowed, memories of descent through fire, of agreements sealed in silence, of a promise that humanity would one day be ready to remember its older kin. Whitcomb's notes grew fevered, margins filled with half-translated syllables, sketches of constellations he couldn't name. He hid the pages in his briefcase, aware on some level that he was crossing lines no ethics board would forgive. Colleagues noticed the shadows under his eyes, the way he flinched at sudden noises, the new habit of staring too long at empty corridors as if expecting company. He told himself it was for science, for understanding. But late at night, alone with the soft hum of the facility, he felt the pull strengthen, an invitation, patient and vast, threading through his thoughts like roots seeking water. The boys watched him now with something that might have been recognition, or pity, or anticipation. And Whitcomb, once so certain of his detachment, began to wonder which side of the glass he truly belonged on. In the blackest hours of a February night in 1983, a small team assembled at the edge of the restricted zone where the Arokat Hollow had once stood. Dr. Whitcomb led them, 3 armed security personnel, a linguist carrying recording equipment, and Dr. Hale, who had insisted on coming despite orders to stay behind. Whitcomb's eyes burned with a fervor the others pretended not to notice. His handwritten note had been simple. The boys were calling him back to the place it began, promising answers the facility walls could not contain. They parked a mile out and hiked in under heavy cloud cover, no moon to betray their flashlights. The bulldozed clearing had grown over with rye and early weeds, but the ring of ancient stones remained, half-buried, humming faintly under infrared. Whitcomb moved as if guided, leading them straight to the center where the fire pit had been. He knelt, brushing aside frost, revealing symbols freshly etched into the frozen soil, spirals mirroring those he had sketched in his hidden notes. The air thickened, breath fogging in perfect unison, though the temperature gauge read only a few degrees below freezing. Then the chanting started, low and layered, rising from the ground itself. The security team raised weapons, beams sweeping the tree line. Shadows detached from the trunks, tall, elongated, moving with liquid grace. The linguist dropped his recorder, backing away as the figures encircled the group without sound. The boys emerged next, stepping from the darkness as if it parted for them. Barefoot, clothed in the same rough tunics, eyes reflecting the team's flashlights like polished glass. They had not escaped, they had never been fully contained. Subject A3 walked directly to Whitcomb, palm extended. When Whitcomb took it, the world tilted. Images flooded him again, sharper now, the tall watchers waiting beyond sight, the clan's long vigil, the moment approaching when the bridge would open both ways. One guard shouted, "Rifle up." The nearest shadow figure turned its head too smooth, too elongated, and the man froze mid-motion, weapon clattering to the ground. Frost raced across his jacket in fractal veins. Another guard fired, muzzle flash strobing the clearing. The bullet struck nothing, the figures simply weren't where they had been. The boys did not flinch. Instead, they raised their hands in unison, and every flashlight died. In the sudden dark, pressure built behind the eyes of everyone present, a silent command to kneel, to listen. Hale felt his knees buckle first, then the linguist. Only Whitcomb remained standing, held upright by the small hand in his. Voices layered inside their skulls, not threatening but immense, patient, conveying centuries of waiting compressed into heartbeats. When emergency floods from distant perimeter towers finally swept the clearing minutes later, the team was found alone, on their knees in the frost, weapons scattered. The boys were gone. The tall figures were gone. Only the etched symbols remained, glowing faintly under the harsh light, spirals deepening as if carved by invisible hands. Whitcomb stared at the empty space where A3 had stood, tears freezing on his cheeks, whispering fragments of a language no human throat should shape. The others could not speak at all, eyes wide, reflecting the floodlights in a way that hadn't been there before. In the weeks following the midnight confrontation in the cleared hollow, the survivors, Whitcomb, Hale, the linguist, and the 2 guards who could still speak were separated, debriefed, and placed under indefinite observation in different wings of the same sprawling complex. Interviews grew longer, more repetitive, probing for inconsistencies that never appeared. Their accounts aligned with eerie precision: the sudden darkness, the pressure to kneel, the layered presence that felt both ancient and imminent. Dr. Whitcomb changed first. He stopped resisting the questions, answering instead with calm certainty, describing the boys not as captives or anomalies but as emissaries whose time had finally aligned. He spoke of a convergence, not conquest, but integration, where the visitor's lineage, thinned by centuries of hiding, would reawaken dormant strands woven into humanity long ago. The boys were catalysts, their purer genome designed to resonate with something already buried in human cells, triggering a shift when critical mass was reached. He sketched diagrams from memory, double helices laced with luminous insertions, activation sequences waiting for the right frequency. Blood draws told a subtler story. Hale's samples, taken weekly, began showing faint echoes of the repetitive motifs first seen in the boys, short tandem repeats appearing where none had been, as if his DNA were editing itself in quiet increments. The same markers surfaced in the linguist's white cells, then in one guard's. Technicians whispered about contamination until controls ruled it out. The changes were endogenous, guided, accelerating in those who had knelt closest to the circle. Whitcomb's dreams grew shared. The others reported the same visions: vast fields of stars folding inward, tall figures stepping through veils of light, cities rising and crumbling across epochs, all threaded by a patient promise that humanity had been seeded, watched, and now stood at the threshold of remembering. The boys appeared in these dreams not as children but as conduits, their small forms outlined in cold fire, eyes holding entire constellations. Classified memos escalated. Analysts pieced together the Elder's lore with Whitcomb's new testimony and the genomic drift. The visitations were not random. They were phases of a long cultivation, hybrids planted to stabilize a genome weakened by isolation elsewhere. Earth had been chosen as nursery and refuge. The boys represented the final viable bridge, pure enough to call, human enough to blend. When enough carriers awakened, the veil would thin permanently, allowing passage both ways. Not invasion, the memos stressed in underlined caps, but reclamation. By March, Whitcomb no longer requested release. He sat for hours facing east, palms open, murmuring the sliding syllables that once belonged only to the clan. Security footage caught faint luminescence tracing his veins in the dark, pulsing in rhythm with unobserved geomagnetic fluctuations. Hale found himself humming the same cadence during lab work, fingers moving through sequences he hadn't consciously learned. The guards, less articulate, simply stared at walls as if watching distant horizons. In the highest clearances, debate raged: containment versus observation, termination versus integration. But the changes spread quietly, cell by cell, carrier by carrier, beyond any quarantine. The boys themselves remained unseen, yet their absence felt deliberate, a silence pregnant with approach. Somewhere in the sealed reports, a single unsigned note summarized the shifting consensus. The event had already begun, not with lights in the sky, but with strands rewriting themselves in the dark, preparing the ground for whatever walked through next.